A look at Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is one of the most well-known parts of not only the book of Genesis, but of the entire Bible. The famous introductory words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," are known by millions of people. But their true significance is lost in today's world, where we live in a culture and a time which is so different from how the original readers of Genesis 1 would have understood the text. In order to understand the nature of Genesis 1, we first need to understand the culture it was written in. Ancient Israel was a part of an area that biblical scholars call the ancient Near East. This included Israel, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Babylon, and other nearby areas. Evidence suggests that these cultures and people interacted with each other, trading both goods and knowledge, though the extent of these interactions are debated. This meant that most likely the people of Israel, that is, the original readers of Genesis 1, would have also been aware of how other cultures understood how the universe came to be. The type of works that describe the creation event are known as cosmologies. It may have been the case that the author and original readers of Genesis had direct access to these ancient Near Eastern cosmologies, or it may have been the case that a general understanding of these events was simply part of the cultural baggage, in the same kind of way that Shakespeare plays influence our literature, television, and language today, even for those who have never read a single word of what he's written. Regardless of whether there was a direct confrontation with ancient Near Eastern cosmologies or not, it's certainly true that the readers of Genesis 1 would have been aware of how other people understood the world being created. And this is really important when it comes to understanding the creation account in Genesis 1. The discovery of other ancient Near Eastern cosmologies, such as the Babylonian story Enuma Elish and the Sumerian Atrahasis epic, have all been posited as a potential original version of the Genesis creation account. That is to say, some scholars have previously suggested that Genesis sort of made up their own version of these cosmologies. The accusation is the author of Genesis simply stole another creation account and made it their own. Scholars have observed that there are a number of parallels between ancient Near Eastern cosmologies and the biblical creation account. There's separated creations of the light and the sky and the dry land, a divine rest on the seventh day, separation of the land, a watery chaos in the beginning, and some accounts even talk about man being made in God's image. But contemporary scholarship now overwhelmingly rejects the view that Genesis 1 based itself on other ancient Near Eastern texts. In fact, to the contrary, Genesis 1 is a purposeful declaration of the inaccuracy and insufficiency of these other cosmologies. To provide an example, think of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. In this book, the protagonist is a businessman named Scrooge, a mean-hearted, miserable, selfish man whose only interest is money. But we're introduced later in the book to another businessman named Mr. Fezziwig, Scrooge's old boss, who has a very different attitude towards money than Scrooge. He's generous and kind and jolly. Now, there's a number of parallels between Scrooge and Mr. Fezziwig. Both are businessmen, both are in charge of their company, both interact with one another. But this parallel doesn't demonstrate that Scrooge and Mr. Fezziwig are really the same person. In fact, Dickens purposefully contrasts them. In his book, we're told that when people see Scrooge, they neglect to speak to him, but when people see Mr. Fezziwig, they call out blessings. Scrooge's phrase is the miserable "bah, humbug," but Mr. Fezziwig's is the upbeat "hoddy-ho." You see, there are a number of parallels between Scrooge and Mr. Fezziwig, but it's clear that Dickens' intention is to portray them as being contrasting opposites. Dickens is saying, don't be like Scrooge, be like Mr. Fezziwig. Similarly, the book of Genesis contains many parallels with the ancient Near Eastern cosmologies. But this isn't to show that the ancient Near Eastern stories and the Genesis cosmology are the same. Rather, like Dickens' intention with Scrooge and Mr. Fezziwig, the author of Genesis' intentions are to show the superiority of the biblical creation account and the God who made everything, in comparison to any view that says otherwise. There are loads of examples in Genesis 1 that show its intention is to contrast other ancient Near Eastern texts. Other cosmologies talk of creation by magic and mythological creatures and other gods being made to be worshipped. But in Genesis 1, the universe isn't created by magic. It's instead created by a very real divine word. In Genesis 1, the universe isn't full of mythology and deities. Rather, it's full of one God alone, who makes things that are subservient to him and not to be worshipped. One of the biggest clues of this is that in many ancient Near Eastern cosmologies, there's a battle between the gods and a dragon. The Hebrew word for this dragon is the same Hebrew word for sea creatures in Genesis 1:21, where we're told, God created the great sea creatures. This is a purposeful shutdown of the ancient Near Eastern creation stories. These mighty dragons that the gods battled with in ancient Near Eastern texts. Genesis 1 doesn't use the normal Hebrew word for sun and a moon, because they were associated with this kind of pagan worship. Instead, in Genesis 1, God creates the greater light and the lesser light. Further, in many ancient cosmologies, the gods struggle to separate the waters. Whereas in Genesis 1, God simply creates, separates, and forms all with ease, without resistance and struggle, by the power of his word. You see, this is one of the points of Genesis 1. To the original reader, it was a massive bold declaration of the inaccuracy of other ancient creation myths and their gods in contrast to the one true creator God of Israel, who by his word created the heavens and the earth. In other words, Genesis' author was being like Dickens screaming, "Don't be like Scrooge, be like Mr. Fezziwig," with his own shout of, "Don't follow the pagan gods and their myths. Follow the one true God of Israel, who created everything by the word of his power." Genesis 1 is making a really clear point. In ancient texts there are battles between gods, but in Genesis 1 there are none. There is no battle because there is no rival to God. In ancient texts, often a god is enthroned the king of creation, but there is no enthronement in Genesis 1, because God is already king. There is no rival to him. There is no one to oppose him and no one to fight him. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is the opening chapter to, yes, a story about creation, but at the same time it sets up the uniquity of God as being so much greater and higher and more powerful than any other.